Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. In the previous lesson, we talked about the window object. And if you'll remember, I said that the browser is made up of a hierarchy of objects, and at the top is the window object. Well, today we are going to start looking at the object that is directly beneath the window object, and that is the document object. Actually, it would be more correct to say we are going to start looking at the document object model, or more commonly referred to as the DOM, D-O-M. It's a set of objects that we use in order to access the individual elements within the page, manipulate them by changing their content or their style. We can also use the DOM to dynamically add elements to the page, or we can even remove them if we need to. The DOM is really where we spend most of our time whenever we're writing JavaScript, because if we're writing JavaScript, we're typically writing it to interact with the web page in some way. So today we will start looking at the DOM by seeing how we can access elements within the page, because there are several ways that we can do so. If you remember from lesson 1, we discussed how browsers load HTML content. It starts at the top and then goes to the bottom. And we also talked about that we typically want to place our script files at the bottom of the page. And the idea was it doesn't really change the overall download time of the document, but it does change the amount of time needed to download the content. Because if we put our script at the top of the page, the browser has to load our script before it loads the content inside of the body. Well, there's another benefit of doing so. If the browser has loaded all of the content, then our code can access those elements. Because if we place our script at the beginning of the page, we cannot access any of the content within the body element because it's not loaded into the browser. So if we try to access any of these P elements or even this div, it's not going to find it because it doesn't exist. The browser hasn't loaded those elements yet. So this is another reason why we typically want to place our scripts at the bottom of the page, because it allows the browser to completely load the rest of the document so that we can access those elements. Before we write some code, let's look at the structure of our HTML. In the case of what we're doing today, it really helps to know what the structure is so that whenever we write the code, we know what results we should have. In the real world, whenever you're writing applications, you don't have to know exactly what the structure is. Of course, you typically do need to know some of the details, but especially if that HTML is dynamically generated by some server-side code, be it PHP or ASP.NET, you typically aren't going to know everything about the web page. But since we are learning this, it would help to know everything about it. So we have 4 paragraph elements, one right after another, and then we have a div element that contains a P element. So let's say that we want to select all of the P elements regardless of how they're nested. So we want to get not only the 4 inside of the body, or at least directly descended from the body, but we also want to get the P element contained within the div element. Well, we have an old method that allows us to do this. First, let's create a variable. We are going to select all of these P elements and assign them to this P elements variable. And we need to specify the document object. So document is all lowercase, and then the dot, and then we have a method that is get elements by tag name. It is an extremely long method name, but it's very descriptive as to what it does. We pass it a string value containing the tag name of the elements that we want to select, and then it will find those elements within the document and assign them to whatever variable that we are assigning them to. The getElementsByTagName method returns what looks like an array, but it's not an array. In fact, it's a special type of object called nodeList. The nodeList object is given to us by the DOM API. It's not native to the JavaScript language. And what's so special about nodeLists is that they are live. They are a live representation of the elements within the document. So whenever we call getElementsByTagName and specify P, it's going to retrieve all of the P elements. And while that's obvious, what isn't obvious is that we can remove p elements, or we can add p elements after we have called this get elements by tag name and assign it to p elements, and those changes would be reflected inside of p elements without having to call get elements by tag name again. Now, we're not going to see the live nature of node lists today because we don't know how to create or remove elements from the document. We will discuss that in the next lesson, and then I'll show you how node lists are indeed live. So you're just going to have to take my word for it. But we can use node lists a lot like we can use arrays. There is a length property, so let's do p_elements.length. And whenever we run this within the browser, we will see the value of 5. And since these are a lot like arrays, we can also use a loop to loop over them. So let's use a for loop, var I equals 0, length equals p_elements.length, I is less than length, and then we need to increment I equals I plus 1. And so let's just do p_elements and then specify the index. Now, we're not going to get a whole lot of useful information from this, but we are going to see that we are getting an object of HTML paragraph element. This HTML paragraph element is actually the name of the object of a paragraph element. That's the name of the object given to us by the document object model. And we can see that we are going to get this 5 times. So we can use them like an array using the length property, and we can also use them within a loop. Now let's say that we wanted to retrieve the p element inside of the div element. Well, we already have a reference to it inside of our p elements, and since this is the last p element in the document, then it is the last p element in our node list. So we could just create another variable. Let's call this last p element, and we will use p elements p_elements.length -1, and that will give us a reference to that last p element within the document. So we could use this last p element variable to access that one element. But that's rather inefficient, especially if this is the only element that we want to retrieve, because the getElementsByTagName method has to search throughout the entire document to find all of the p elements, and then we have to get the last p element. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just get one element at a time? Well, we can do that. But first, we have to give that element an ID value. So I'm going to give this p element an ID of foo. And then instead of calling getElementsByTagName, we can call another method called getElementById. So I'm going to call this variable p_element document.getElementById, and then we pass it a string value containing the ID of whatever element that we want to retrieve. So this will retrieve the p element on line 14 inside of the div element, and let's just alert p element. It's not going to give us very useful information, but it at least will show us that we are retrieving the element object, because it's saying object HTML paragraph element. If it didn't find that element, we would actually get null. So I've changed the ID value. If we go back to the browser, refresh, we get a value of null. So if you're writing code for a page that may or may not have an element with an ID specified in the getElementById method, it would be a good idea to use an if statement to ensure that you do indeed have an element object to work with. Because if you try to use a property or method on a null object, you are going to get an error, which is going to cause the rest of your code to fail, because the browser stops executing JavaScript code whenever it encounters an error. But if you know without a shadow of a doubt that the page has an element with that particular ID, then feel free not to perform any type of check whatsoever. Just use the element object as you need to. Now, the getElementById and getElementsByTagName methods are old. In fact, they've been around since the early 2000s. We can use CSS queries to find elements, and we do so by using two different methods. The first is querySelector. This will return the first element that matches whatever query that we've specified. So if we do p, This is going to find the first P element in the document and return it to P element. So let's do alert P element, and let's use a property of an element object called parent node. Now, everything in the DOM is a node. We have different types of nodes. We have element nodes, we have attribute nodes, we have comment nodes, we have document nodes, we have a ton of other different nodes. But everything is referred to as a node. That's where we got the name of node list, because it's a list of nodes. So every object in the DOM has properties, and because of which they are all nodes. And one of those properties is parent node. So this is going to get the P element on line 9, and then we use the parent node property to get its parent, which is the body element. And then we can use a property called tag name. This will get the name of the element, which is body. So whenever we run this code, we will see body inside of the alert box. So let's say now that we wanted to select all of the P elements within the document, we would do so using the query selector all method. And this will return a node list. So we need to change our property to length here so that we can see how many P elements it selected. So instead of using get elements by tag name, we can use the query selector all, pass P, and it will select all of the P elements. So if you go back, refresh, we get the value of 5. And these have been simple CSS queries. So let's say that we want to select the P element inside of a div element. Well, let's continue to use query selector all. This is again going to select all of the elements that match that particular query. So if we do div and then P, we will see a value of 1 because there's only one of those within our document. But if we go back and actually copy and paste some, so let's do 2, 3, and 4. And I know that these have multiple IDs with the same value. I really don't care about that right now. I will here in a second, but if we go back to the browser, we will see 4 because we have 4 of those paragraph elements inside of a div. So we can use CSS queries, whereas we couldn't do so just a few years ago. And this is a much better way of finding elements within a document. So let's get rid of all of those with an ID of foo. Let's change this back to query selector. And then let's use the pound sign to specify ID and foo. And this is just like using the document.getElementById method, except we are using a CSS query to do so. So if we go back to the browser, refresh, we get undefined because I didn't change the property here. So since we have an individual element, let's do the same thing. Let's do parent node, which is going to get its parent element, and then tag name. So whenever we run this code, we should see the value of div inside of the alert box. So there we go. That's how we can find elements within the document. We'll stop here for today. In the next lesson, we will pick up where we've left off, and we'll talk about how we can dynamically add and remove content from our web page. So pretty cool stuff. Have a good one.